Recently, the sporting world lost a massive figure, and in this case, I mean that quite literally. Big George Foreman, former undisputed and multiple-time heavyweight champion of the world in boxing, passed away at the age of 76. George hadn't been nearly as active in the last 15 years or so, but prior to that, he was a larger-than-life figure with a radiant smile and an indomitable personality that commanded the room anytime he was on camera. And it didn't hurt that he stood 6'3" and weighed around 250 pounds for the second half of his boxing career. As I didn't start watching boxing until the early 90s, other than the occasional Rocky movie anyway, I missed George's first run at the top when he stormed to a 40-0 record that just happened to include a second-round technical knockout over the then current and undefeated champ, Smoking Joe Frazier. Now just think about that for a second. Frazier was 29-0 at the time with 25 knockouts, and then Foreman comes in and 4.5 minutes later, he's the champ. And that 29-0 record wasn't just against a bunch of nobodies. Frazier beat Muhammad Ali in 1971, not quite 2 years before that Foreman fight. Now, this all happened long before I was born, so by the time I started paying attention, Foreman was known for his famous line of indoor grilled kitchen appliances and not for his right hand. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there are some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because the George Foreman grill is exactly where you know him from, and you had no idea he'd been a boxer or even what boxing is, since it's essentially been replaced by the UFC over the last 20 years or so. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'll admit I used to have a George Foreman grill myself. It worked, but it was also a pain to clean, which is probably why I don't remember what happened to it. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. George retired from boxing in the late 70s to become a preacher, but after about 10 years or so out of the sport and the spotlight, he decided to come back. Clearly, preaching didn't quite pay the bills. George fought frequently after his return in 1987 and earned a title shot against Evander Holyfield on April 19, 1991. Foreman lost a 12-round decision that night, but the fight established him back as a player in the heavyweight scene. And between that and his very public persona, which included appearances on late-night talk shows and an eventual sitcom called, yes, you guessed it, George, Foreman was a natural choice to have his likeness rights used to sell a video game. And technically, we've already witnessed that once on the channel, when George Foreman KO Boxing for the Master System was covered as part of the review for James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing back in episode 156. And if you missed that review and are confused by that, I'll try to explain in a bit. Today's review, however, is for the Genesis version of George Foreman KO Boxing, which is a totally different game. So is this George Foreman KO Boxing a knockout on the level of the Frazier fight from the 70s? Or is it more of a disappointment like Foreman's loss to Tommy Morrison that almost ended his career in 1993? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of George Foreman KO Boxing for the Genesis. And immediately from looking at the package, I'm a bit worried about this review, for reasons I'll get into in a minute. Aside from that though, this particular copy is in pretty nice shape, and actually before this week, it had been resealed in shrink wrap for probably a significant amount of time, so that's why there's no dust on it. No scratches or gouges to the outer cover, the hang tab is intact at the top of the case, and the inner cover looks great as well with no water damage or edge wear, and only some sun bleaching on the spine, which isn't really noticeable unless you know what to look for. On the inside, the cartridge and manual look nice as well, and we'll take a look at those in a minute. With this being a sports title that only features the George Foreman license, you'd probably guess that it's not terribly valuable no matter the condition, and you'd be correct. The Genesis version is easily the cheapest version of the game out there, with complete copies averaging around $10. I feel like I don't see this one all the time when I'm at stores or conventions, but if you wanted a copy of it, I'm sure you wouldn't have to go too far to find one. As far as this cover goes, yikes, where do I start? Well, let's go with the background. They went with a black background so that everything would stand out in comparison, and that's fine, but it also means things stand out. So if what's on the cover doesn't look good, it really doesn't look good. And the first thing that you notice that really doesn't look good is the title, which doesn't even really feature a logo. It's just the name of the game in block font with KO in massive letters, because for some reason they wanted that to stand out. I suppose I get what they were going for, but man, there had to be a better, less lazy way to go about that design. Beside that, there's the pictures that are used, starting with a shot of George in the background appearing to punch someone, but the picture is clearly edited and shaded enough to where you can't tell who it's actually supposed to be anymore. But it looks like it might have originally been a picture of Mike Tyson, who, ironically, George Foreman never fought, even though there were rumors of them trying to set up a bout when Tyson got out of prison in the mid-90s. And it's like, okay, that picture's strange enough, but then there's the picture of George in the front to sell the game, and it's blurry. In comparison, the Master System version looks normal, so I don't know what the hell they did to screw this up. But it clearly wasn't the best designers at Acclaim, Flying Edge, had on staff. And believe it or not, it gets worse, because take a look at the Mega Drive version. It has the same terrible art and logo, and it's got the PAL formatting that cuts off the bottom of the picture. Just wow. Mercifully, let's slip over to the back, and we've got some pictures of your opponents at the top, and then some screenshots at the bottom, complete with another picture of George. The flavor text in the middle isn't horrible, but it's not great either, and this particular section confuses me. While the computer judge tracks the action. Why is judge in quotes? Just seems like a super weird thing to emphasize on their part, and absolutely no one playing an arcade-style boxing video game cares about scoring. Opening up the package, and there's the manual, which, as mentioned, looks barely used. The manual starts out with a full-page biography of George, which is nice for all of the kids out there that were too young to know his history, and then goes into the basics like controls and bios of the 15 opponents that you'll be up against. I think they did a good job with this. It's clearly not a very complicated game, but they put more effort into the manual than they did on the outer cover. Okay, that's the package. Let's put up our dukes and see if we can lead Big George to the title, or titles, as the case may be. If you've ever watched a big boxing pay-per-view, one of the things that you may notice is that there are a lot of belts. So many to the point that it can be a bit confusing to try to keep up with which ones actually mean anything. The reason for all the belts isn't just the different weight classes, with each having their own champions, but also the fact that in boxing, there's multiple different sanctioning bodies. This might seem a bit odd if you're used to watching UFC or WWE, where on their shows, the only belts that are fought over are the belts that that particular company owns. In boxing, fights are put together by individual promoters, and since those promoters can pick and choose which sanctioning bodies that they want to work with, it's common to see either fight nights where the undercard may have a fight that determines a different champion than the main event, or perhaps a fight where there's a unification bout where a champion from one sanctioning body is fighting the champion from another sanctioning body, with the winner winning both championships. Earlier, I referred to George Foreman as being a prior undisputed champion, and that means probably exactly what you think it means, in that George was the champion for all of the major sanctioning bodies in the heavyweight class at the same time when he held the championship. This happened at the fight I mentioned earlier when George beat Joe Frazier, who had previously been the undisputed champion. Being that that happened in 1973, at the time there were only two major titles to win, the World Boxing Association, or WBA Championship, and the World Boxing Council, or WBC Championship. Since that time, there have also been two other major sanctioning bodies added to the mix, the World Boxing Organization, or WBO, and then finally the International Boxing Federation, or IBF. You might be wondering why I'm bringing all this up, and it's because it actually serves as the plot of the game, as minimal as it might be. In January of 1993, when George Foreman KO Boxing was originally released in the United States, George was still fighting, despite his advanced age, and lost to Evander Holyfield a few years prior. So, the background of the game is that you're playing as Big George, as he is on a mission to win all 4 major championships and become the undisputed champion once again. And before you write that off as science fiction and something that could only happen in a video game, after the game was released, George would go on to achieve half of that goal when he defeated Michael Moore on November 5th, 1994, in one of the more unexpected boxing results that I've ever seen live, due to the fact that almost everyone had written off Foreman at the time, as he was almost 46 years old, and one fight previous, he had lost his chance at the WBO championship to Tommy Morrison. Yes, that Tommy Morrison from the Rocky film that we don't speak of. Beating Moore won him the IBF and WBA championship, and had he beaten Tommy Morrison in his previous fight for the WBO championship, he would have only had to beat Oliver McCall to become undisputed champion once again, something that actually wasn't incredibly far-fetched, due to the fact that the only reason McCall was champion to begin with was because the previous champion, Lennox Lewis, overlooked McCall as not being a threat, and was more focused on a future fight with Moore for his 2 titles, as Moore hadn't lost to Foreman yet at that point. Anyway, now that you know more about the heavyweight boxing scene in 1993 and 1994 than you probably cared to, let's get back to the game, which again sees you as Foreman in his quest for gold. The game doesn't have any kind of licensing aside from Foreman's name, so you won't be boxing any of his peers that I just mentioned, and none of the titles that are mentioned by name, or ever even really shown for that matter, which is a little odd considering how important championships are in any kind of sport. The only way you really even have any kind of indication that something happened is because after every few fights, you get a static screen cutscene and a password allowing you to continue from that point if you need to later on. As much as I'm a big proponent of battery backup for save games, I understand that it wasn't always viable from a cost perspective, and at least the passwords given out in the game are relatively simple, although they are a bit confusing if you're trying to read one from the internet. Pro tip, the passwords are written left to right from top to bottom. It took me a few minutes to figure that out. Speaking of the password system, oddly, there are passwords for each of the 15 fights. The computer just doesn't tell you what they are, only the few that serve as checkpoints. This is a good thing for people that genuinely like the game and want to be able to practice on one particular fighter that is giving them trouble. So, of course, the developers decided to go with a checkpoint system instead of actually helping the player out. But with this being 2025 and the internet being a thing, I suppose at least the functionality is there, even if it means technically resorting to cheating. As far as those developers go, I haven't really mentioned them so far, but I did make an offhand remark about immediately being worried about the quality of the game based on the cover in the box section. The reason for that is a name that is very prominent on the cover, especially in the European version, and that is Flying Edge. If you're not familiar with Flying Edge and are wondering why that would be a problem, well, Flying Edge is actually a claim, and Flying Edge was just the branding that they used on Sega releases to get around Nintendo trying to bully them into only releasing games on their consoles. If you don't know why a game from Acclaim in the early 90s might give you pause, well, consider yourself lucky, but let's just say they didn't always have the best quality control on their titles, especially amongst licensed games. In the case of George Foreman KO Boxing, while the game was published by Flying Edge, aka Acclaim, when you dig a little deeper, you find that the company actually responsible for the game was Beam Software. Beam Software has a bit of history when you look into it, but for our purposes, I think it's important to focus on where the development firm was specifically in 1993 when George Foreman KO Boxing was released. Previously on the channel, I reviewed 2 other games developed by Beam in 1993, with the first being Tom and Jerry Frantic Antics, a platformer based on the Tom and Jerry movie that was released around that same time, but for some reason not using the Tom and Jerry movie branding, unlike the Master System game that did use the Tom and Jerry movie branding that actually has nothing to do with the movie. That game I didn't hate, so other than the odd branding, which probably wasn't their fault, they get a pass. However, what's probably more important is the other sports game that being worked on at the time, NBA All-Star Challenge. And if you're not familiar with that game, well, let's just say that in the Year 6 retrospective video for the channel from a few months ago, I still had NBA All-Star Challenge as the 4th worst game that I had reviewed from approximately 270 games that had appeared on the channel at that point. You can see why I might be a bit concerned here. But which is George Foreman KO Boxing? Is it a horrid sports game that I hope never to have to look at again, much less play? Or is it an oddly branded middling platformer? Well, digging into the game itself, there's at least something here, but it's certainly not going to be for everyone. And full disclosure, I'm in that not everyone camp. But that's not necessarily a quality concern as much as it's a genre preference that I'll get into in a bit. As far as the game goes, I've already mentioned how the continue system works in relation to the backstory of the game, but that was probably a bit out of order, so I'll try to clarify what's going on. In single-player mode, your goal is to fight 15 other boxers, which will have you rising up the boxing ranks and, as mentioned, uniting the major championships along the way. Essentially, you fight a boxer, hopefully defeat them in 3 rounds or less, and then move up the ladder to the next, and so on and so forth. If you lose, it's actually not the end of the world, and much like in real life, you can recover by having a rematch with the boxer you previously fought. And if you win that fight, move back up to have a rematch with the fighter that you originally lost to again. But don't lose 2 fights in a row, or else it's time for Big George to pack it in and go have some cheeseburgers, possibly prepared on a George Foreman grill. Or probably not, because he was like a millionaire. Anyway, the progression system, while I don't hate the concept, ends up making the game boring and repetitive, because what will invariably happen is that you get your ass handed to you, and then have to waste 10 minutes beating a fighter that you've already proven you can beat, just to get back to the same fighter that cleaned your clock, where you hopefully might get a little bit better and potentially learn some strategies as to how to deal with them, and then promptly forget all that because you lose and you're dumped back to the previous guy again. It's a pretty vicious cycle, but to the developer's credit, I suppose at least the boxers' records that are displayed in their bios before the fights are updated accordingly based on wins and losses, so that's a nice touch. As far as the actual game portion goes, the fighting is pretty simple. The A button controls your left, the B button controls your right, and the C button is used for a super punch attack that in 3 hours of playing the game, I could not figure out how it was actually awarded. The manual states that the super punches are given out for performing combos, but I rarely completed any due to the fact that not frequently dodging out of the way is a death sentence. So figure that one out, I can't. This is a problem because without these super punches, you're not going to stand a chance past the first few fighters, which is the exact problem I ran into, not being able to even defeat the 3rd fighter. And just as a reminder, that's the 3rd fighter out of 15. As you can imagine, that gets a bit frustrating, so I went back and reread the manual, just in case there were possibly clues as to how to defeat each of the boxers, similar to what we saw with Tough Man Contest. And no clues here. After messing around with the game for a bit and watching video of someone playing the game on YouTube, I got to the point where I felt like I had a chance of beating that 3rd fighter, so I don't want to give the impression that I think the game is impossible, but based on everything that I've previously stated, I just didn't have the patience to keep trying, so any footage in the video of me fighting someone beyond that Bolo Young ripoff was a result of me putting in passwords to experiment with the other fighters, and make the review not quite so boring. From a graphics perspective, George Foreman's KO Boxing isn't bad, but it's also nothing special, and compared to the aforementioned Tough Man Contest or maybe something like Super Punch-Out, you won't be impressed. To be fair to KO Boxing, though, both of those games came much later, so it shouldn't be expected for them to directly compare, and the developers did achieve a goal of having each of the boxers having a decidedly different look, complete with portraits in the lower corners that give a close-up of each boxer's face, to give you an idea of how badly pummeled they're getting. Unfortunately, that's really the only variety you'll see, as every fight takes place in the exact same ring with the exact same audience,
and the exact same ring girl between the rounds. The best way I could describe it is aggressively mediocre, and I think the most interesting graphic touch I saw was that in between rounds on the stat screen that shows how the boxers are doing, there's an ad for Doritos up in the corner. But even then, it's the same ad each round. Couldn't they have had multiple sponsors? The in-game sounds fares better than the graphics. Not by a lot, but I was at least impressed by the quality of the digital speech that's included in the game. Both George and the opposing fighters will say things before the rounds start, and the speech samples used are crystal clear, something that's not always the case on Genesis titles due to how FM audio works and the amount of space that it needs for decent quality samples. The music included is decent as well, nothing super impressive, but not bad, although you won't be hearing a whole lot of it due to the fact that during the fights there's no music, and no crowd noise for that matter unless someone gets knocked down. I think my final stance on George Foreman KO boxing is that it's for a specific type of gamer, and that's one that likes punch-out style boxing games where you spend the whole time learning and responding to patterns, much like puzzle games. So it should come as no surprise that, like puzzle games, I don't really like those type of boxing games, and if the game was going to fall in that category, it would really have to do something extraordinary for me to recommend it. George Foreman KO boxing is not extraordinary. It's pretty ordinary, and in fact, and due to that, I'm giving it 2 stars. I do think that there's a decent game here if you like this sort of thing, so if you're looking for an inexpensive punch-out style game on the Genesis, maybe give it a look. But as for me, it's going back on the shelf, and I can only hope that next time we see Big George on the console, it will be a better experience.
And that's it for George Foreman KO boxing for the Genesis. Sometimes in sports, you'll get to witness things that you'll end up remembering for the rest of your life. And in my case, George Foreman takes up one of those memories. That win over Michael Moore was something that I had never expected to see, and it happened so quickly too, as it often does in combat sports. Just 1 second, everyone is going about their business, and then bam, someone's on the canvas. If you enjoy rooting for the likable underdog, that was a fight to see, to be certain. It would have been nice if George Foreman's KO boxing matched that excitement, but unfortunately, it just wasn't meant to be. For the next review on the channel, it's the game that I was originally supposed to review this week. It's a game that, along with Mortal Kombat, allowed Midway to redefine the arcade experience in the mid-90s. I logged tons of hours playing it back in the day, as it was related to both years where Blockbuster held their World Championship tournament, but even then I probably should have practiced a little bit more because I got boom shakalaka'd in the first round. However, just as a programming note, that most likely won't be the next video that you see on the channel. Instead, I'm going to try to record my discussion at MGC next weekend, where I plan to discuss games that appeared on the Genesis and the Master System. It worked out pretty well in 2023, so hopefully no technical issues as well this year, fingers crossed. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 277. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.